and he is an infectious diseases specialist at Yale New Haven Hospital, an associate professor. His main area of expertise is HIV, but as just like everybody else, in the last year, COVID has taken prime position in all our lives. And for him, the way he's approached this is to get very active in the research, in trying to treat and then prevent COVID. So initially, he was involved in some medication trials, and then went ahead to do the Pfizer vaccine trials. There are many degrees that people can get. Some things that don't have degrees. One of the things about Dr. Ogbuagu is that he's very passionate about his people, and he is also very, very passionate about health, equities, making sure that everybody has access to, proper health care. And when we called him to say, hey, Dr. Ogbuagu, can you do this? He's a very busy man. He was in the midst of rounds, and he picked up the phone. I was like, hey, what's going on? I'm like, oh, can you do this? I'm like, yeah. No, be our people. I'm in. Just set the date. I'll be there. So I know you guys did come here to hear me talk. I'm going to, have him talk very soon. Maybe he'll tell us a few things about the vaccine, and then we can just go straight to question and answers after that. So thank you, Dr. Ogbuagu.
Yeah, thank you, Bayo, so much for organizing this, and I'm really impressed with just the number of participants on the call. I think there's 127, 126 individuals, showing that there's a lot of interest in learning about vaccines. So it's really my honor and my privilege to talk to all of you. And I'm actually very excited that people from our community are interested in learning more about COVID-19. As everyone here knows, Black and brown people are disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 for a couple of reasons. One is, we have a little bit more of the comorbidities or other underlying medical conditions that have been associated with worse outcomes from COVID-19. There are systemic and structural inequities that disproportionately affect people like us, that limit our access to optimal medical care. The systemic and racial inequalities also make us very suspicious of systems, including healthcare systems, and of course medical research, and that colors and clouds our desire to participate in some of those endeavors. So, like Bayo said, a lot of my career is really focused on advancing therapeutics through clinical trials, mostly for HIV. And of course, since the COVID pandemic hit, I've been involved with both treatment and prevention trials. So, drugs like remdesivir, et cetera, and then now the Pfizer vaccine. So I think the message I really want to send here as a frontline researcher with the Pfizer vaccine is really to really be a messenger about the value that clinical trials bring to the treatment and prevention of disease, how important it is to participate in those trials, and maybe by communicating some of my thoughts around how important these trials are, that it can at least start to impact the level of trust we have as a community for some of these activities. We'll be willing to not only participate in scientific advancement, but also to allow us to be beneficiaries of breakthroughs when they do occur. So that's just a bit of a summary. I must say I've been burdened by a lot of the negative messages out there. I follow social media like everyone else, Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, and sometimes I'm really distressed by some of the information out there. And unfortunately, there's lots of negative messages. Some of them are totally outlandish, conspiracy level theory type things. But there are messaging that are out there, and that can impact the way we view therapeutics or view vaccines. And of course, can limit the way we are willing to utilize them. So I'm very happy to have this be a Q&A session and try to address some of the myths, questions out there around the COVID vaccine. So thank you for having me. I'm very pleased to be part of this group. So Bayo, do you want to moderate with the questions, or do you want me to just read them off?
So, Doctor, we
Bayo,
have a few questions here. Yeah, so I think some have been sent to you. So at least the ones that I've seen, I'm just going to go by the first one I have here. We heard that the vaccine has demonic ingredients. How true?
Okay, so I'm sure everyone knows that that's not something to worry about. I did put on my Twitter feed something that I think is important, that you know, there's all kinds of conspiracies about the constituents of the vaccine, and I think the use of the term genetic code bothers a lot of people, and there's the perception that, you know, genetic-based vaccines can be used for nefarious activities. Now, the constitution of the Pfizer vaccine, or the mRNA vaccine, is essentially, it contains messenger RNA, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. The messenger RNA is really protein-based, and is a very fragile structure that easily gets broken down if given in the body. So to protect the messenger RNA, the vaccine is made in a form where the mRNA is coated with different kinds of, you know, lipids or fats, essentially to protect the mRNA. So when it's given, the fatty outer layer helps it get into target cells, releases the mRNA. Now, I want to be very clear. Messenger RNA is what the body reads off to produce protein. So messenger RNA is the genetic code for proteins. Messenger RNA is not DNA. Messenger RNA is not incorporated into the host DNA. So any questions around, is the mRNA vaccine, does it integrate into the human being's genes? That does not occur, okay? It happens, a lot of the mRNA vaccine processes happen outside of the nucleus. So it happens in the cytoplasm of the cells. And the whole point is, what the vaccine does is that it makes your body produce a protein structure that looks like the virus, so that your immune system responds to that. And because that structure looks like the virus, whenever you expose to the virus in the future, your body already has preformed or pre-made or pre-existing antibodies that help you attack the virus. So the beauty of mRNA technology is it's not incorporated into the host, so it doesn't affect or alter your DNA in any form. In fact, the mRNA lasts in the body only for a couple of hours. So if you get the vaccine today, by tomorrow, it's all gone. So it really has a very short period of time to prime your immune system to recognize the virus in the future. So again, not integrated, a safe strategy, and you know, it contains essentially that, and mixed with a salt solution. There's no preservatives in the vaccine, which is even a novel thing for vaccine. So we think it's very safe. And like I said, you know, does its job and it's out of the body very quickly. So I think that addresses that question.
So the next question is, Lisa, we have, if someone has been tested positive for COVID-19 in the past, should he or she be vaccinated?
So that's a very good point. So you know, that's important, because when people have COVID-19, when you recover from COVID-19, you develop antibodies to the virus, at least if you recover. What we know for sure is that for those who have mild COVID, the antibodies levels that you generate tend to disappear quickly, so that as early as the first 2 months following recovery from mild COVID, the antibody levels decline pretty significantly. In about 40 to half of people who have mild COVID have, you know, almost no detectable antibodies 2 months after the infection. But those with more severe disease, they tend to have higher levels of antibodies, and those antibodies tend to persist. But even in those with severe disease, the antibody levels tend to wane over time. So natural immunity, or immunity following infection with the virus, doesn't last forever. And actually, if anything, it's short-lived. And we've seen cases of reinfection whereby people who've had COVID 3-4 months, on average later, can be reinfected with the virus. So we know that, again, natural immunity acquired after people recover from the virus may not last forever. And so that's why, we definitely would prefer that people develop immunity after, from the vaccine, that we hope should at least be longer lived than natural immunity. In the clinical trials, we did not include people who had symptomatic COVID coming in. We excluded people who had that, but we actually did include people who could have had asymptomatic infection. So we screened by symptoms. If you had symptoms, you had disease that was confirmed, we did not include you in the vaccine studies. But if you came in without knowing you had COVID, and we actually detected that 3% out of the 44,000 people in the study actually had pre-existing antibodies to COVID, which means that about 3% of people in our study had asymptomatic COVID-19 infection. Those individuals received vaccine, and we found that the efficacy of the vaccine was similar in those who had prior asymptomatic infection compared to those who did not. So we think the vaccine would work in people who have had COVID. But that said, I think that individuals who have recently recovered from COVID, so let's say within 3 months from recovering from COVID, I do not think those individuals should be prioritized for vaccination because they're not at the highest risk, especially since we have very few vaccine doses. So again, the answer to your question is if you tested positive for COVID, there could be some benefit to the vaccine, but I think that in the immediate aftermath of recovering from COVID, you do have some level of protection, at least for a few months after infection.
So I'm going to ask a few questions embedded together. Will the vaccine be yearly like the flu, and will it be mandatory for folks?
Okay, so we don't know if it would be yearly like the flu. It depends on two factors. One is how long does the vaccine immunity last? So if the vaccine immunity lasts 6 months or 1 year, right, it makes sense to get it again. The other question would be, would the virus mutate or change enough that it's able to evade the immune responses generated by the vaccine? So think about it like the flu, right? The flu sometimes can change its conformation so that it's not susceptible to the vaccine that you get. For example, I think the efficacy of the current vaccine is less than 50% for flu. So, the coronavirus does not mutate like the flu, it mutates very, very slowly. And we haven't quite seen mutations that so alter the spike protein, which is the vaccine antigen, that would raise concern that the vaccines we have now wouldn't work if the virus changes. So I think most of us think that even the little changes that are occurring, the virus are not the type that will jeopardize response to the vaccine. So my answer is, I don't think the virus is going to change that much, I would predict, and so that the vaccines we have do work, and that if the vaccines we have, if they last long enough, then we may not even need it to be an annual vaccine. And then what was the other question, Jide?
Is it mandatory? Would it be mandatory?
Okay, so we know that the flu vaccine, for example, is mandated for health workers, okay, with very, very few exceptions. My sense from policymakers, at least from the task force that's currently making policy on distribution for the vaccines, at least in the state of Connecticut, are that they would not be mandating the vaccines for everyone. I think there's a recognition that at least the first wave of vaccines are relatively new, and I don't think anyone's quite willing to mandate it. But that said, obviously we talk about mandates because the concern is if you don't mandate the vaccine, what would the uptake of the vaccine be? And that's the critical point, because if you think about it, a vaccine can be 95% effective, but that does not mean that efficacy is real world effectiveness, right? Because the vaccine can work. If nobody takes it, we'll still have COVID. So to translate the efficacy of the vaccine to real world effectiveness, we need people to take the vaccine high enough numbers so that we can achieve the so-called herd immunity. Herd immunity is when you have enough people in the community who have antibodies or protection against the disease, and so the disease can fizzle out. And so the concern is that the proportion of Americans and I'm sure it reflects even on the state level in Connecticut or wherever part of the US you are, or whatever part of the world you are, that if we have majority of people unwilling to take the vaccine, we would never really be able to achieve that community level protection that causes the epidemic to fizzle away. So that's a concern. And so that's why I think it's critically important, even if there are no mandates, that we all try to get the vaccine, and that's how we'll get to the end of this pandemic ultimately. As you may know, even in the United States, that the willingness of racial ethnic minorities, especially African Americans and Blacks, to take vaccines are lower than every other racial group. Lower than Hispanic, definitely lower than Asian, lower than whites in general. And again, because we are disproportionately impacted by COVID, I think it's such a bad combination where we're disproportionately affected, and then we're more likely not to want to even take a vaccine that will protect our community. So this is one of the reasons why I'm doing this talk again, to reassure us that the vaccine technologies are safe, and the vaccine efficacy results are real, and that we really stand to benefit as a community from having high levels of uptake for the vaccine.
Yeah, so I think that takes us into, I think I've seen a few questions about, I think you talked about it a little bit, but can you talk more about, did we have enough Black participation during the trial period? I think some people are also relating this to the Tuskegee trial as well too. So can you talk a bit more about that?
Good point. But just in case there's anyone here who doesn't know about Tuskegee, but Tuskegee was a clinical research study where they were looking at the long-term effects of syphilis. Syphilis is a bacterial sexually transmitted infection, right? And so the trial involved mostly African Americans, mostly men, and they were intentionally infected with syphilis. And even when there was treatments like penicillin, that the treatments for syphilis were not made available to these individuals. And this study went all through, I think, early 70s or so. So it's not too long ago that this happened. And so, this has really fed a lot of distrust and mistrust by minority communities about clinical research in general. And then add to that the background of Black Lives Matter, where people of color feel, that their lives are valued less than others, structural systemic racism, and some of those significant societal issues that are really important and color the way, people like us view authorities, view health systems, feel like we're treated differently. So you can't, ignore those issues, and those issues have to be at least addressed, or at a minimum, acknowledged, right, for us to feel comfortable to engage in clinical research. So in the Pfizer vaccine study, the proportion of people who were identified as Black or African American was about 10% of the study. Pfizer vaccine trial was about 44,000 individuals. It was about 10% Black, 4.5% Asian, about 20-something% Latino or so. But altogether, the contribution of racial ethnic minorities to the Pfizer vaccine study was roughly about 40-something% globally, around 30% in the US. So just kind of matching the population percentage of the racial ethnic minorities. So it wasn't ideal, but it was decent. And so again, 10% of 44,000, it's at least, 4,400 ballpark of Black individuals that we did. In certain sites like mine here at Yale, here in New Haven, minority percentage was even higher. We had, I think, about 41% of our participants that we contributed to the trial were racial ethnic minorities, so most predominantly Black and Hispanic individuals. But I have to tell you from my experience that it took a lot of work to be able to engage people of color in research. And one of the programs we have at Yale that allows us to do this more effectively, we call it a Cultural Ambassadors Program. And that's how we've learned as a community of scientists and researchers. We've recognized that if you want to engage racial ethnic minorities in clinical research, you have to build relationships of trust with them. And so we've done that for over 10 years, dealing with pastors of churches, community leaders, leaders of community-based organizations, explaining the research plans to them, helping them inform how to advertise those research. They help us design recruitment tools. They participate sometimes even in rigorous things like designing study protocols. And I think that that level of community engagement has really made it successful, so that, whenever we are engaging in a new research study, for example, COVID research, we're building on existing relationships, and it makes it so much easier because, like someone probably mentioned, we've built the currency of trust, and that facilitates engagement of communities of color in research. So there's still a lot of work to be done. That's just one model to do that. But again, I always, side talk, I always say that if you think about any medication you ever took for anything, think about treatments for malaria, think about, treatments for an autoimmune condition, think about treatments for hypertension. Clinical trials are what made your physicians know that those medicines work to help a condition. Every medication you take went through a clinical trial process. And so is the usual process by which we evaluate therapies, whether they be treatments or prevention modalities, to assess if they work. And if we don't, as the communities of color, participate in research, and we're excluded from research when those treatments are found to be effective, it would be hard to generalize or to extend those results to our communities, because if we're not in the study, we don't know if it works in people like us. So again, this is just a shout out. I think that, again, we need to be more participatory in clinical research and drug development process. And the last thing I'll say is, since Tuskegee and so many other negative things that have happened in the clinical trial space, there's so many more protections, that have been put in at institutional levels where there's strong oversight of clinical trials. So nowadays, it's almost impossible or extremely difficult to conduct an unethical trial. Whenever any of us comes up with a clinical trial that we want to pursue, we always go through oversight by an institutional review board. Yale has that. So if I have a clinical trial protocol, they review my protocol, they ask me who I'm going to enroll in the study, what are the risks and harms of the intervention, what are the potential benefits of intervention. The goal will be to minimize risk, optimize harms. And so there's so many levels of protection that currently exist to make sure that clinical research is safe as possible, it's equitable, doesn't prey on vulnerable populations. There's all those safeguards there. So, it would be very difficult for a Tuskegee type study to happen in this day and age.
Thank you for that. So I'm going to ask you a few questions embedded based on what you've just said as well too. So I think one is this safe for pregnant women? What is the youngest age? And how about people with allergies? I think there are a few questions about if you have an allergy, like what do you do, or should you take the medication?
Great question.
And did they participate in did people with allergies participate in the trials?
Yeah. So let's classify allergies, right? So if you're talking about allergies, like I have spring allergies, I have a runny nose or things like that, we don't really bother about that. If you got a vaccine and your arm hurt for a little bit, those don't really count. But when we're talking about true allergies that we worry about, we're thinking of people, for example, who go into shock with a vaccine, so on the much more severe spectrum. So usually when we do treatment trials, including the Pfizer vaccine trial, we asked people if they've had history of severe allergies, or anaphylaxis, which is shock, which can be a life-threatening response to anything. And we excluded those individuals, okay? And most of you must have heard that there were 2 people since UK started vaccinating, I think yesterday, that there were 2 people who had non-allergic reactions who had allergies to the Pfizer vaccine. So again, the advice would be for those who are allergic to a lot of things and have history of severe allergies to medications, it may make sense to stay away from the vaccine for now. That said, if we do know that someone has a history of allergy and we want to give them a new medication, there are ways and protocols by which we can mitigate or decrease or impact that risk. We can sometimes pre-medicate people with certain medications, something like Tylenol, sometimes steroids, sometimes antihistamines. So there are protocols we can actually use in people who have known allergies to allow them to tolerate a drug if we think that the benefits of intervention outweighs the risk. So yes, there will be a warning that if you have a history of severe allergies or anaphylaxis, that you probably want to avoid the Pfizer vaccine. I think that's fair. When it comes to age, initially we enrolled people 18 to 85, so it had to be adults. But later on, as the study went along, we dropped the age, the lower limit to 16 and then to 12. So we have about 100 people between 12 and 15. We have about 293 or so people between the age of 16 and 18 in the study. And of course, studies are planned to, in the future, to even go down to a lower age. I think the Moderna vaccine folk may be going down to age 7 or so in future studies. But these younger pediatric populations were not included in some of these results that you're hearing now. So just to be clear about that. For upper age limits, the upper age limit initially was 85, but we raised the cap later on so that we didn't care what age you were. So 90, 100, we didn't care you got the vaccine. In fact, interestingly, older people tended to have less reactions to the vaccine, both local reactions like pain at the injection site, as well as systemic reactions like fever and some of those other side effects, which is good. And so it seemed to be at least well tolerated by older people, and the efficacy was similar across age groups. The last question you asked was about pregnancy. Again, in clinical trials, we tend to exclude pregnant women for the first wave of clinical trials, and same thing for the Pfizer vaccine study. We did not include pregnant women, and we encourage people who were within women of childbearing potential to use contraception as well as their male partners as well. That said, it appears that in spite of all of this, there were 23 pregnancies on the study, including a couple that were not a couple as a couple, but a few people who were pregnant before they received the vaccine. Some people were pregnant in between the vaccine doses, and some people got pregnant weeks after they completed the vaccination series. We don't quite have the data on the pregnancy outcomes. We don't expect there to be anything crazy, but at least I think some of these cases may, again, add to some of the information we have about the safety and efficacy of the vaccine for people who inadvertently got pregnant on the study. So you stay tuned on that. But for now, we didn't intentionally enroll people who were pregnant.
So talking about immune, if I have an immune issue, do I get it? Am I immune to this? And related to that as well, some people get the flu vaccine and they still get it. Is this the same thing that could happen here?
Great question. So when it comes to if I get the vaccine, can I get it? So 95% efficacy, just throwing the numbers out there, means that if 100 people get the vaccine, 95 of them will not get the at least symptomatic infection. So the outcome we looked at was symptomatic COVID. We didn't really look at asymptomatic infection. So we looked at having symptoms and having laboratory diagnosed COVID. Okay, so it's 95% efficacy on preventing symptomatic COVID. So in the Pfizer trial, there were 170 cases. 162 cases of COVID were in the placebo arm, so the group that got just the saline shot, and only 8 in the arm that got the vaccine. That's how you calculate the 95% efficacy. So the vaccine was really highly effective in preventing against symptomatic COVID. If you look at the group that had severe infections, I think it was about 9 in the placebo group and 1 in the vaccine group. And actually the one person in the vaccine group that was labeled as having severe disease wasn't even hospitalized. I think they just had an oxygen saturation level that was low. So it's pretty clear that the vaccine, even for those who have breakthrough infections, the so-called 5% that had breakthrough infections, not 5% of vaccine recipients, but for the people in the vaccine arm who got the disease, it was of less severity. So it seems that the vaccine prevents against COVID, and for those who get COVID on the vaccine, that it mitigates the severity in them. So I think those are very nice results. For immune deficiency is broad. So if you have uncontrolled diabetes, you're immune deficient. If you're older than age 65, you're immune deficient. If you have HIV, you're immune deficient. If you're a transplant recipient, if you get steroids for an autoimmune condition or other condition, you're immune deficient. So sometimes the term immune deficiency is very broad from an infectious disease standpoint. So we did enroll people with HIV in the study, but at the time the study results were released, we didn't accrue enough HIV patients in the study to make any conclusions about its efficacy in that group. And that's what's going to be sent to the FDA that way, that we just don't know about its efficacy in HIV. We excluded transplant recipients. We excluded people who were on steroids for autoimmune conditions. We excluded people with HIV who were not being treated. We excluded cancer patients who are on active chemotherapy. So while some immune compromised patients are at higher risk of getting COVID and dying from COVID, because we were concerned that some of these conditions may affect the individual's ability to mount an immune response to the vaccine, some of them were excluded. So just be aware that, while we did include some groups that will be considered immune compromised, some other groups, again, active cancer patients on chemotherapy, people receiving a decent amount of steroids for autoimmune or other conditions. This is oral steroids, not inhaled steroids or topical steroids. This is systemic steroids. Transplant recipients were not included in the group. But, conditions like diabetes, for example, were included in the group, and we actually found no difference in efficacy for diabetes compared to those who did not have diabetes.
Just going back to the pregnancy question, I think we talked about pregnancy, but what if you are breastfeeding? Is it safe for people who are breastfeeding?
It's the same thing. So we wouldn't advise to do it for breastfeeding patients. Again, we're not doing this because we have any concern about the Pfizer vaccine being harmful to babies. It's just standard practice that you want to, study the vaccine in other groups, and if there are no concerns, you then expand it to some of these other groups. So it's standard practice not to include pregnant and breastfeeding mothers in research studies, at least in the first wave of studies. And so we're just doing it like every other study, but not because we anticipate any issue with some of those. So I think the advice for now would be, since we just don't have enough data about pregnancy and breastfeeding, to avoid it in those groups for now.
Are there any other groups that have been exempt from getting the vaccine, or that you're not advising?
Not really. I think it's the immune compromised patients, like we mentioned, pregnancy, and that we don't have data in the very young children. So, under the age of 16, there's very limited data. So under the age of 16, pregnant breastfeeding mothers and patients who have quite severe immune compromise. Now, just to be clear, for those who have severe immune compromise, this is not the kind of vaccine to worry about. Usually it's when we use what we call live attenuated vaccines. So vaccines, that we use, some flu vaccines are live attenuated, for example. Measles, mumps, rubella is a live attenuated vaccine, right? So some of those vaccines you want to be cautious with giving to people who are immune compromised. But this is an mRNA vaccine. It doesn't replicate. There's no vector involved. So theoretically, at least from the science part of it, it doesn't seem like it should be an issue for immune compromised patients. But I think the concern would just be, would they have the same amount of immune response that people without those conditions would have? And that's why we just say for now we don't have sufficient data in some of those groups.
Yeah, so there are some other technical questions in terms of the storage of the 70 cc. Like, how are you guys dealing with that?
Sorry, the what?
So how are you managing the 70 OC storage requirements for vaccination distribution?
Oh, yes. So, how would I put this? It's a distribution issue. Pharmacy chains know about the cold chain, the requirement for -60 to -80 degrees centigrade. These are sub-zero degree freezers. Not many hospitals have that capacity or clinics. But we're finding out that the Pfizer has come up with storage containers where you can put dry ice and pack up to almost 1,000 vials of vaccine, and it can stay for weeks at that temperature. So, think about, I don't know, those of you who do know about immunizations and cold chains that we even do in Africa, where you have like these special coolers that you can put ice and pack vials of vaccines. And that's how you could take to villages in Africa, for example, to deliver vaccines. So it's not the first time where, because of the cold chain requirement for vaccines, that we come up with innovative ways to be able to make it accessible to places that just don't have the capacity to store. So there are special storage containers that are coming up. Dry ice is easy to find, although has to be handled very carefully because it can cause frostbite, for example, if you mishandle that. And we're learning that the vaccine, after thawing, can last in the fridge for 5 days. So yes, it's an issue, but there are innovative ways being worked out now to be able to, in spite of that cold chain limitation, to make it as widely available as possible.
So given that this is very new and this has never been done before, I guess there was one question about, is this a chip to install into people to get, to get people to have it, to track people? How do you dispel that myth?
It's conspiracy theory. Unfortunately, I see videos of a graduate from my medical school, University of Calabar in Nigeria, who's spewing out all kinds of, negative conspiracy theories that are very disappointing. And, there's lots of videos out there from so-called experts who are spewing out. If you turn on a video and someone tells you this integrates into your DNA, after today's talk, just know that they have no idea what they're talking about. So anyone that you see, once they start the video and you hear them say this integrates into the human host, into the genome, if you hear them mention DNA, then they have no idea what they're talking about. Turn off the video, total nonsense. So again, this is just new technology, like every other technology that has emerged to address some of the big medical threats that we have. And so this I just label as conspiracy theory. There's no code to anything. It's just an innovative way to have individuals achieve immunity against the disease. That's all I'll say.
So I guess in that, I think there's another question, like what, if any, are the long-term projected concerns of gene editing process of manufacturing this vaccine? How do I address those patients with this question?
So this is not gene editing. There's no gene editing happening here at all. It doesn't interfere with an individual's DNA. So there's no gene editing whatsoever. It uses genetic technology to run the virus, but there's no impact on the human genome whatsoever. So I just want to be very clear about that. There's absolutely no gene editing that's occurring here. Again, the vaccine doesn't even get into the nucleus, which is where we house our DNA. So it doesn't even get close to that. So some of those concerns are unfounded and totally inaccurate and not true.
Okay, I think I'll go with a few more questions and we'll see if other people have questions that we'll have to have them ask. I think you talked about, there were 100, this is again very specific, 162 people who ended up being safe, like were they asymptomatic or COVID-free? And if it's asymptomatic, I think what were their symptoms? I think this was going back to when you asked the question, when you were talking about the testing and trials.
So just to correct it though, there were 106, the 162 number I quoted was people who did not get the vaccine who got COVID, right? So again, there were 170 cases that occurred in the study. 162 out of the 170 got COVID who were in the placebo arm. So they didn't get real vaccine. And there were only eight people in the COVID vaccine arm. Okay, so again, that's showing that the vaccine was quite effective in preventing disease. And like I mentioned, if you look at the subset of the 170 that had severe disease, almost all of them were in the placebo arm. And the one in the vaccine arm actually just had a low oxygen level and really wasn't that sick. So that the vaccine protects against severe disease. That's just to reiterate that.
So, and I guess, I think there's a question too about two doses. Will the two doses confer permanent immunity, or will it just be eventually one? And how long does one have to? How long does the vaccine last? So take one or take two?
Yeah. So the study was designed as a 2-dose vaccine, and that was based on some of the earlier phase clinical trials where we saw that you really need the second dose of vaccine to have antibody levels at target. And the target was, we looked at what the antibody levels were in people who recovered from COVID as the reference. So when we vaccinate you, we want to see that you achieve or exceed the antibody levels in people who've recovered from COVID. So that's kind of like the bar. So we found that people need the second dose to boost the antibody levels at a level that would exceed, that target antibody levels. So we do need the second shot of vaccine. That said, we found that after the first vaccine, even after just the first vaccine, and remember that this is a 2-dose vaccine given 3 weeks apart. So you get vaccination 1, 3 weeks later, you get vaccinated 2, and you're done. We found that even after the first vaccination, about day 10 to 14, you started to see a difference between the new cases of COVID in the vaccine arm as compared to the non-vaccinated arm. So that it appears that as early as 2 weeks or even a little less after the first vaccine, that it already starts to confer protection against COVID. But the efficacy between dose 1 and dose 2 is quite low. It's around 50-something% and rises to 95% protection a week after you get the second vaccine. So again, it's really 4 weeks, so after the first shot of the vaccine and needing the second shot of the vaccine, that you really achieve the fullest level of protection. And I think that even though we don't know how long the antibody levels, how long the protection conferred by the vaccine will be, it at least makes sense that getting the second dose of vaccine is very important to having not just sufficient levels of antibody, but hopefully to give you the best duration of protection that the vaccine can offer.
Thank you for that. Dr. Comfort OB has a question. You can now ask your question.
Thank you, Dr. Ogbuagu. Great accomplishment. The concern is about, do I take Pfizer vaccine or do I take Moderna? What is the main difference between the two vaccines? So if I am your sister and I'm 68 years old, which of these vaccines do you recommend that I take? Thank you.
All right. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Obi. You're my sister from another mother, right? So listen, so first of all, for now, we don't have the luxury of choice because there's insufficient vaccine doses for people that need it. So even while the first phase that everyone is aware would involve healthcare workers and residents of nursing homes, we still don't, between Pfizer and Moderna combined, there's barely enough vaccine for that first wave of vaccination. So you only have choice when you have enough. And probably won't have enough till like mid 2021. So to tell you that you even have a choice is not accurate. I think most of us will really just have to take what we get. Now that's it. Pfizer and Moderna are literally like twin vaccines. They're the same technology, mRNA. The studies were conducted differently, but can you imagine that Pfizer was 95% effective, Moderna was 94.5% effective. So I always say that Moderna proves that the Pfizer results are real and Pfizer proves that Moderna results are real because you have two same technology vaccines, different companies, studied differently by different sites, but the same results. So I think we can have a decent level of confidence with the Pfizer vaccine or the Moderna vaccine. The Pfizer numbers are a tiny, tiny bit, 1%, a little better than the Moderna vaccine, but it's not significant or any significant difference. So I would recommend, if you're my sister, if Moderna comes to you, take it. If Pfizer comes to you, take it. No big difference. There's a difference in the storage requirements. Moderna can be kept at fridge level temperatures or freezer level temperatures, like routine, refrigerator, freezer level temperatures. The Pfizer vaccine has to be kept at much colder temperatures, but once they're warmed up, anyone is fair game. So for now, I'm not going to allow myself to be biased because I was involved with one of the trials and not the other, but I think both vaccines are pretty effective, and whichever one of those that comes available to you, take it. Now, the viral vector vaccine, so AstraZeneca, for example, that reported 70% efficacy, and I don't know when Johnson & Johnson will report theirs, but those ones are viral vector vaccines. They're not mRNA vaccines. The efficacy of those hasn't looked so hot compared to the mRNA vaccines. If you asked me when those are available, should I take the mRNA or the viral vector vaccines, for so many reasons, I would probably recommend the mRNA vaccines. Okay, so we're not there yet to choose. So whichever one becomes available, I feel very confident taking them myself, and I would recommend that you take any one of those that becomes available to you.
Thank you. We have Rita with a question. So Rita, you can go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Onyema. This is Dr. Oji speaking. So I joined late in case you've said something about my question. I was just wondering, how long does the protection, the antibody by this vaccine last after you've taken the second dose? Is it forever?
We don't know. So for now, we have 2 months data after the second dose, and the antibody levels look good. Okay, we're studying the patients through 2 years. My people who are coming back for 6 months follow-up will start to come in around March of 2021. But we also have some data from the early phase studies, like phase 1, phase 2. You know, we may start to have 6-month data sometime December, January, but those are very much fewer individuals. So we don't know for sure. The 2 months, it looks good, but I couldn't tell you about 6 months and a year. So we just don't have that data yet.
Yeah, am I allowed to ask a second question? Just a very short one. So is this vaccine more like a protective dose against the coronavirus? Does it do anything for people who are already kind of having the disease?
Yeah, so we went through that a little bit. So we 3% of people in our study had coronavirus before they came into the study. They probably weren't symptomatic because we screened for symptoms before people came in, and they said no. So we're assuming that these people were people who had asymptomatic COVID, didn't know about it, but we detected antibodies to the virus. They also experienced the same level of protection against COVID that others got. Interestingly, certain numbers of people who had the antibodies at entry of the study still got coronavirus. So reinfection is a thing. Reinfection happens. We actually had, we had people who had antibodies to coronavirus, which means they've had it in the past and they still got COVID, there. But of course, most of these were placebo recipients, right? But that just goes to show that reinfection happens. And so, the people who've had COVID in the past, especially those who've had COVID quite a long time ago, like a couple of months ago, could potentially benefit from vaccination, and we're studying that as well.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Ade Akin has a question. Ade, mic is yours.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. Highly appreciated. Just have a question. You had mentioned on the figure of 162 and 170 people with asymptomatic reaction, and also that is that indicative of the total sample population in this testing?
At the time the 170 cases were accrued, I think was about 37,000 patients that we got that data from. So it's based on observations in about almost 38,000 participants that 170 cases occurred in. So, that's how the efficacy assessments were made. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question correctly. So the total number of observed people was about 37,000, and it's among that group that the 170 cases of COVID occurred.
Kingsley, I think you have a question.
Yes, thank you very much. I was just going to ask, I know you've said the vaccine has to be taken in 2 doses. So my question would be, for some of us who are not in the US, who have access to, I think, a different vaccine, for instance, the UK, I think they're still considering the other vaccine. Would it still be as effective if you take one for the first dose and then take another for the second dose? Because I know the percentage levels are different.
Yeah, so crossing over and taking dose of one and a second dose of other, you're in uncharted territory, because obviously no one has done those kind of studies where you receive one of one and then one of another. How would I say this? Not to get too technical, but for the viral vector vaccines, okay, so these are like the AstraZeneca vaccine, Johnson & Johnson vaccine. One of the things that can influence the effectiveness of those vaccines is anti-vector immunity, okay? So it's interesting that there's a geographical difference in the level of antibodies in the community. So in other words, if you're delivering the vaccine through an adenovirus and you already, either because you've had a past adenovirus infection, have antibodies to the virus, it can blunt or diminish or decrease the efficacy of the vaccine.
Right.
Okay. So in certain areas, including in sub-Saharan Africa, where we have a lot of antibodies against adenovirus, certain types of vaccines may not be ideal for our population because you deliver the vaccine with the virus, but we have antibodies against the virus, and that, we kill off the virus and don't give it time to stimulate our immune system. Right. So I think there's still so much more to learn about which vaccines are best for which populations, but I certainly wouldn't advise crossing over from one vaccine to another because we just don't have that data on if they're synergistic, which means do they compound the effects of each other? Do they diminish or blunt the efficacy of each other, or does it stay neutral? We just don't know, so I wouldn't advise that.
Sorry, just as a follow-on, and I think the question is important because from an African perspective, like for instance, I live in the UK. If I were to take, and I know it's not available for me now, if I were to take the vaccine now, first shot, and then go to Nigeria and it becomes available, I would then have to, ask myself the question, do I take this? Is this different? So that's why I posed the question, just to sort of put in perspective from the challenges we face back home.
I agree. So how do you overcome that? The way you overcome that, and I think the Johnson & Johnson vaccine may be evaluating a single dose approach. So obviously, I think that one of the downsides of at least the first set of vaccines that have reported efficacy is that all of them require 2 doses. So there's space, or there's room, or there's a need for a single dose vaccine. Yeah. And I think that a lot of people are looking at that to see how that can be achieved.
Thank you.
Babatunde, I think you have a question.
Oh, yes. Thank you, doctor, for doing this. Really appreciate it. I actually wanted to ask, like most vaccines in the past, they took like years to develop. Why is this something that is safe for everybody to take?
Great question. So I usually joke, and this is not original to me, but I think I heard it on the news somewhere that, especially in the US, you will understand the joke, right? That because we've called this Operation Warp Speed, right, it fuels the perception that everything was rushed and hurried, okay? And add to that all the politics behind the COVID-19 response just in general, it's kind of fueled some of the concern and suspicion people have. Now listen, let me say this authoritatively, okay? So in my career, I've done clinical trials, and it takes years between when you say, would this compound work for preventing this disease? Let's test it in animals. Let's then test it first in human, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials, right? Those take years. What changed for COVID is that because we had a disease that was on a global scale, that was really like freaking everybody out because of the morbidity and mortality, more than ever before, key people that deal with drug and vaccine development came together. So biotech industries, biopharmaceutical industries. So for example, the Pfizer vaccine, BioNTech is a biotech company in Germany. They created a vaccine. Pfizer is a biopharmaceutical company partnered with BioNTech because you need hundreds of millions of dollars to get anything through clinical development. So Pfizer supports BioNTech, gets it done. And then academic institutions like myself and researchers like myself work closely with pharmaceutical companies to advance the products for vaccine development. So what changed with COVID is that all of us came together with one single focus, and which was, you know what, this is a global problem. Let's find out how we can solve this. So there's unprecedented cooperation between people who don't normally work together, coming together to solve a public health problem. So if anything, I think it's a tribute, a testament, kudos to the scientific research community, pharmaceutical companies coming together to solve a common problem. And we learned to do clinical trials more efficiently without jeopardizing safety or quality of the trials. And so the trials have occurred quickly because we learned how to do things efficiently, not necessarily because they're being rushed or shortcut or shortchanged. You know, I'm part of the process, and so I can tell you. In fact, I now think that because of what we've learned with COVID, for future drug trials, and I do mostly HIV therapeutics, maybe we will learn something about how efficiently we did this for COVID, and we should take it back to other disease conditions and try to fast track some of the processes we need to do that. Because when a disease is out there, it's killing people, it's harming our economy, it's taking a huge toll on all of us collectively as a global community. You can imagine that this has galvanized and really, forced us to collaborate and cooperate in unprecedented fashion. So again, I just want to reassure everyone, the steps we're taking, we went through the early phases, through the later phases of clinical trials. There were safety safeguards, and no shortcuts, just more efficiency.
I had one more question, please.
Yeah.
Like the vaccine. Okay, there's a small percentage of people that have natural immune towards COVID. Now, if say for example somebody, male or female, whoever, takes the vaccine, does it weaken their immune or does it enhance it in that situation?
So when you say natural immunity, I think you're going back to what I've addressed before. So when we say natural immunity, it doesn't mean you're immune to COVID before you see it by yourself. Natural immunity in this context is that you were infected and you developed antibodies to that. And I've explained how some of those antibody responses are short-lived. They don't last too long, especially those milder disease, that they tend to fizzle away pretty quickly and leave you vulnerable to reinfection. And of course, everyone's reporting cases of reinfection in a couple of months after people recover from COVID.
Thank you. Last question though. How are they getting closer to getting a treatment for it too?
Yeah, so I was part of the remdesivir studies. Remdesivir is the approved antiviral for treating COVID. It works good. It decreases the duration of symptoms. It may reduce mortality a little bit, but we didn't find that there was a statistically significant difference in mortality, at least in the studies that I was involved in. So there's emergency use authorization of I think it's baricitinib, which is a JAK inhibitor as well. So there's very few things, and dexamethasone, which is a steroid, has also been shown to decrease mortality in people who need oxygen. So there's very few therapies we have. And the JAK inhibitor has to be combined with remdesivir. I think that's in the narrow context it was studied. So unfortunately, after all the clinical trials and everything that's going on, we literally have just 3. Only remdesivir has been approved, and then we have emergency use authorization for the other ones. Hydroxychloroquine does not work. I want to be very clear. Hydroxychloroquine does. I don't care what anybody says. There's tons and tons of trials, WHO, US-based studies. Hydroxychloroquine does not work. It doesn't work to prevent. It doesn't work to treat COVID. I want to be very clear. So we have remdesivir. We have the JAK inhibitor that can be combined with remdesivir, and we have steroids that we use for severe cases. Those are really the only effective therapies that we have now. That said, there's many other therapeutic products. I have clinical trial protocols currently running. Combined. I've worked with CCR5 inhibitors. I've worked with combination therapies, remdesivir, that we're currently running as clinical trials, but we just don't have any evidence that they work quite yet. Many of them are still in clinical trials.
All right, thank you very much. Good job, bro. Keep.
Sorry about that. I think we have an iPhone. I think we're just gonna, again, 2 questions per person so that we keep it moving. We have about maybe 23 minutes left. So I think I don't see a name, just says iPhone. So can you go ahead?
Oh, it's probably Miss Anthony. Thank you, Dr. Onyema, for the presentation. I'm an epidemiologist. I understand science, and you are actually sound in your presentation. I'll probably be the first person to take the vaccine in my hospital. We are scheduled to get it by tomorrow or next if it's approved. But my question to you is, since I'm going to be the first to take it, have you taken the vaccine?
You're asking me?
Yes.
Okay, so the vaccine will be available in my institution. When you conduct the clinical trial, you're not supposed to you or your family or any of your interests are supposed to participate in the trial, because we ran it as a randomized control blinded trial, and it would have influenced my determination of cases of COVID, cases of COVID that I'm adjudicating safety issues. But that said, my institutions should have the Pfizer vaccine available. And I am going to put a video on my Twitter feed. My Twitter feed is at Dr. Onyema Ogbuagu, so just look forward to a vaccine of me. You know, I'm really excited, going full circle, you know, something that you study, getting to the point where it's approved for use and taking it yourself. I mean, there's no greater satisfaction. So, you know, I will be doing that. But I couldn't because of restrictions around using it. But my friends, my colleagues, you know, everyone I could get, you know, definitely did the study, and they're happy that they did.
One more question. Thank you so much for that answer. That's very, very thoughtful and honest of you. For anybody that is listening that has any ambiguity about taking the vaccine, please, I guarantee, I recommend that you take it. His answer just to this question proved that actually what he has been telling us for the last, how long that this presentation has been going, is absolutely correct. Thank you very much. You make me proud to be a Nigerian. God bless you.
We will take one last question because I muted that person already. So that's Dr. Nwafo, because I know we scheduled this to go through 9, and we have to be cognizant of the doctor's time. I think he has some other appointments as well. So one last question from Dr. Nwafo, and then we'll wrap this up.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Ogbuagu. Thank you for all the wonderful presentation. Just want to ask, if there is a delay between the first and second dose, maybe 3 months, 4 months delay, will there be waning of immunity? You know, will the efficacy will it still be strong? Will the immunity still be strong? Maybe later on, if there is 3 months gap between the first and second dose, what will happen? Because most people might not get the first dose. By the time the second dose is coming, there might be a long span. Will there be waning of immunity? Or the efficacy, will it still be strong, or will it still be low, medium? What do you think?
Yeah, great question. Thank you for asking. And that also always is the concern with the 2-dose vaccine. What if people get one, travel, can't get it? You know, someone talked about, you know, what if I'm visiting the West to go back to Africa and had only the first dose, I can't get the second dose? You know, what if a life event happens, I get the first dose, can't get the second dose? Those are all very valid questions. So what I will say is that, again, based on the studies, you need that second dose to have that 95% protection. You need it. And we don't know the durability yet, but I would predict that you need the second dose to prolong the duration of protection that you have. So I think without a doubt that receiving a single dose of at least the current vaccines would be suboptimal, would not be ideal. Could you be protected? Probably. I told you that the data shows that 2 weeks, you know, as early as 2 weeks after the first dose, you're protected. But again, we don't know how long that protection lasts. So I think based on the early phase data, I wouldn't recommend just one dose of the vaccine. I'd recommend you complete the series. But if you're asking me, should I not get it at all or get a single dose? Of course, get a single dose and get the benefits, you know, and, you know, deal with getting the second dose later. For now, the difference between the doses is 21 days. In the study, we allowed a +2 -2, so you can get it 19 days or 23 days after the dose. So there's a 5-day period in which you can get it. So it doesn't necessarily have to be 3 weeks on the dot. So just to put it out there. So 1 dose better than none, but 2 doses better than 1.
Right. Thank you for your time. I don't know if you want to have any last thoughts for folks. I think you mentioned your Twitter handle. I think some folks have asked for you to be their mentor, you know, so some folks have asked for a recording for this. I will work with Dr. Afolalu on how to get that recording out there to, you know, those who are sent out the invite. But any last words from you and any handles that you want folks to go to, Doctor?
Yeah, I want to say thank you, Jide, for moderating. Thank you, my bestie, Bayo, for organizing this. I really appreciate all of you. I just can't imagine the level of interest in something that was just set up, I don't know, a few days ago. So I'm also excited